Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The operating room is a sacred space, a theater of meticulous control. It is a world bleached of color, reduced to sterile white and surgical green, bathed in the unwavering glare of powerful lights. The air itself is different, filtered, chilled, humming with the quiet life support of monitors that translate the body's hidden rhythms into beeping lines on a screen. This is a place of profound ritual, where the frailties of the human body are met with the pinnacle of human skill. It is a place built on a foundation of absolute trust. You, the patient, surrender everything. You surrender consciousness to the anesthesiologist's cocktail of drugs. You surrender control of your own breathing to a machine, and you place your life, quite literally, into the gloved hands of a surgeon. You trust their decade of education, their grueling years of training, their sacred oath to first, do no harm. But that trust is not placed in a single individual alone. It is placed in a vast, intricate, and seemingly infallible system that stands behind that individual. You trust the university that conferred their degree, the residency program that honed their skills, the state medical board that granted their license, and the hospital that vetted their credentials. You believe, with every fiber of your being, that these layers of oversight form an impenetrable shield against incompetence, against impairment, against malice, against the unthinkable. This system is the bedrock of modern medicine. It is the silent promise made to every patient who signs a consent form. But what happens when that shield is an illusion? What happens when the system is not a safeguard, but an enabler, a series of locked doors that fail, one after another, allowing a monster to walk through? What happens when a man who should never have been allowed to touch a patient is given free rein to destroy lives, moving from one prestigious hospital to the next, leaving a wake of catastrophic injuries and death, all while the institutions designed to stop him look the other way? This is not a story about a single, monstrous act of surgical error. It is the story of a slow-motion catastrophe, a contagion of incompetence that spread through the very heart of the Dallas medical community. It is the story of a man named Christopher Duntsch. He was, by all accounts, a force of nature, charismatic, supremely confident, and ambitious to a staggering degree. He held both an MD and a PhD. He spoke of building a multi-million-dollar empire, of revolutionizing neurosurgery with groundbreaking stem cell research. He presented himself as a titan in the making, the kind of star physician that hospitals dream of recruiting. But beneath the veneer of brilliance and the alphabet soup of credentials was a truth so horrifying it defies easy explanation. His hands, which should have healed, only maimed. His knowledge, which should have saved, only condemned. Over the course of 2 nightmarish years in Dallas, Texas, 33 patients would go under his knife. Almost all would emerge broken, paralyzed, or in chronic pain. 2 would not emerge at all. Today, we dissect the anatomy of institutional malpractice. We will explore in exhaustive detail how a man so profoundly and demonstrably dangerous was not only hired, but passed along from one hospital to another, protected by a culture of silence, legal loopholes, and a systemic overseo. End to accountability. This is the story of how the guardians of medicine failed, and the devastating human cost of that failure. This is the anatomy of Dr. Death. Christopher Daniel Duntsch was born in Montana but spent his formative years in Cordova, a wealthy suburb of Memphis, Tennessee. From the outside, his was a life of privilege and promise, the kind of background that seemed to preordain success. His father was a physical therapist, and his mother a school teacher, creating a home environment where education and ambition were held in high esteem. He was a talented and imposing athlete, a linebacker on the high school football team whose skill was undeniable. He was good enough to earn a spot on a Division I team, first at Millsaps College in Mississippi, before transferring to the larger program at Colorado State. He harbored dreams of a professional career in the NFL, a goal that spoke to his immense drive and self-belief. But those dreams were ultimately cut short by an injury, forcing a pivot. With the same ferocious ambition he once directed at the football field, he turned his sights towards a different and in many ways more demanding arena, medicine, specifically the high-stakes, high-prestige world of neurosurgery. He enrolled in one of the most grueling academic paths available, the MD, PhD program at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis. This is not a standard medical education. It is a 7 to 8 year marathon designed to create an elite class of physician scientists, individuals who can both treat patients and run cutting-edge research labs. It is a program that confers immense prestige, and Duntsch seemed to thrive in it, at least on paper. He was prolific, his name appearing on numerous academic papers and patent applications. He latched onto the burgeoning field of stem cell technology, partnering with a Russian scientist named Valery Kukikov to conduct research he claimed would revolutionize the treatment of spinal injuries. Together, they formed a company called Discgenics, and Duntsch, with his natural charisma and unshakable confidence, proved to be a masterful fundraiser. He successfully raised millions of dollars from investors, selling them on a vision of a future where his science would cure paralysis. He was building his brand, crafting the image of a genius poised to change the world. But even then, within the hallowed halls of the university and the demanding environment of the neurosurgery residency program, there were troubling signs, unsettling whispers that something was profoundly amiss beneath the polished surface. Fellow residents would later recall a pattern of deeply concerning behavior. There were rumors that he attended lavish parties, allegedly using cocaine, and would then show up for his hospital shifts. On one occasion, a fellow resident was so concerned about his erratic behavior that they filed an anonymous complaint, suggesting Duntsch had operated after using drugs. The university investigated. Duntsch denied the allegations, but agreed to a drug test and to participate in a physician's health program, an intervention designed for doctors struggling with substance abuse or mental health issues. He completed the program and was cleared to continue his residency. The incident was officially logged and then largely forgotten, a footnote in the file of a promising, if perhaps arrogant, young doctor. His surgical skills, or the glaring lack thereof, were an even greater source of concern for those who worked alongside him. Dr. John Robertson, a supervising physician in the program, would later state that Duntsch was simply not a technically gifted surgeon. In a field that demands microscopic precision and an innate feel for human tissue, Duntsch was clumsy. His hands were not steady. His understanding of basic anatomy seemed, at times, shockingly deficient. He was also, by many accounts, profoundly arrogant and resistant to feedback, a fatal flaw in a trainee. He would argue with attending physicians, convinced that his way was better, even when it was demonstrably wrong. He was known for disappearing for days at a time to focus on his business ventures, leaving his clinical duties to be covered by his already overworked colleagues. He was a resident who seemed to believe he had already transcended the need for training. Despite these numerous red flags, the rumors of substance abuse, the questions about his technical skill, and the complaints about his professionalism, he was pushed through the system. In 2010, after 13 years of postgraduate education, the University of Tennessee Health Science Center signed off on his training. They officially certified Christopher Duntsch as a neurosurgeon, fit to operate on the man, brain, and spine. The first and most critical gatekeeper had failed. The system had looked at a fundamentally flawed individual and stamped him with its seal of approval. Armed with his elite credentials and an ego that had been supercharged by his academic and business successes, Duntsch moved to Dallas, Texas. He was actively recruited by the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute and was granted surgical privileges at Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano, a reputable, profitable, and well-regarded hospital in a wealthy suburb. To the administration at Baylor Plano, he looked like a home run, a star. He came with glowing letters of recommendation, including one from the chairman of his residency program at the University of Tennessee, which praised his knowledge, his research, and his surgical skills. He was the rainmaker they were looking for, a surgeon who could bring in complex, high-revenue spinal fusion cases and bolster the hospital's bottom line and reputation. They were so confident in his potential that they offered him a staggering deal, a 1-year contract with a salary of $600,000, plus signing bonuses and relocation expenses. It was a massive investment in a surgeon who had never practiced independently. It took almost no time at all for that investment to curdle into a waking nightmare. The operating rooms at Baylor Plano, normally scenes of quiet competence, became theaters of unprecedented butchery. His very first solo case was a man named Kenneth Fennell, who required a routine lumbar fusion. During the procedure, Duntsch operated on the wrong part of the spine, causing significant bleeding and nerve damage. A senior surgeon had to be called in to stop the hemorrhage and salvage the operation. Fennell was left with chronic pain and numbness in his leg. This wasn't a minor error. It was a fundamental mistake of geography on the human body. The next case was Lee Passmore, a Collin County Court investigator. His surgery was even worse. Duntsch misplaced a screw meant to stabilize the spine so badly that it impinged on a major nerve. Another surgeon, Dr. Mark Hoyle, would later testify that the screw wasn't even close to where it should have been. Passmore was left with a permanent limp and constant, agonizing pain. The alarm bells were now ringing throughout the surgical department at Baylor Plano. Experienced nurses and surgical technicians began to express grave concerns, noting his chaotic and clumsy technique. They had never seen anything like it. But the cases kept coming. Barry Morgoloff, a pool supply company owner, went in for a spinal fusion to alleviate back pain. During the surgery, Duntsch's crude technique resulted in bone fragments being lodged in Morguloff's spinal canal. When another surgeon, Dr. Robert Henderson, was called in to attempt a repair, he was horrified by what he found. The hardware was placed incorrectly, and the spinal canal was dangerously compressed. Morgoloff lost all feeling in his left leg, and was left in such debilitating pain that he could no longer work or even drive a car. He would later describe the pain as a constant electric shock. But the case that would finally force Baylor's hand, the one that crossed the line from horrifying incompetence into the realm of the unbelievable, was that of Jerry Summers. Summers was not just a patient. He was a childhood friend of Christopher Duntsch's. They had grown up together in Memphis. When Summers needed a cervical fusion to address pain from a car accident, he turned to the man he knew as Chris, the brilliant doctor he trusted implicitly. That trust would cost him everything. The procedure, performed in February 2012, was a complete and utter disaster. In a standard fusion, the surgeon carefully removes a damaged disc and stabilizes the vertebrae. Duntsch, however, began to remove vast quantities of bone and muscle tissue indiscriminately. He damaged the vertebral artery, one of the main blood supplies to the brain, causing a massive hemorrhage. Instead of properly controlling the bleeding, he packed the area with so much surgical sponge and bone graft substitute that it crushed Summers's spinal cord. When Jerry Summers woke up from the anesthesia, he was a quadriplegic. He could not move his arms or his legs. His head was so unstable on his spine that nurses had to hold it in place. He was, in his own words, a breathing head, trapped in a motionless body, able to communicate only by talking. He would spend the rest of his life dependent on a ventilator. The outcome for Jerry Summers was so catastrophic, so far outside the bounds of any known surgical complication, that it sent a shockwave through the hospital. Dr. Randall Kirby, a vascular and general surgeon at Baylor Plano, who had already developed grave concerns after assisting on one of Duntsch's earlier disastrous surgeries, reviewed the postoperative scans of Summers's neck. He was appalled. He would later describe the surgical site as looking like a child had been playing with a Tinker Toy set, with hardware and materials scattered randomly and dangerously. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a brutal, amateurish dissection that displayed a complete and utter disregard for human anatomy. The Jerry Summers case was the tipping point. The hospital's internal peer review committee, the body of physicians responsible for policing their own, finally took action. They suspended Christopher Duntsch's surgical privileges, effective immediately. But what Baylor Plano did next is the absolute crux of this story. The point at which simple malpractice metastasized into a systemic failure of catastrophic proportions. Instead of summarily revoking his privileges and immediately reporting him to the Texas Medical Board and the National Practitioner Databank as a clear and present danger to the public, they entered into a negotiation with Duntsch's lawyer. The result was a quiet, carefully worded deal. Duntsch would voluntarily relinquish his privileges and resign. This seemingly minor administrative distinction had enormous consequences. By allowing him to resign while under investigation, Baylor Plano avoided triggering a mandatory, detailed adverse action report to the National Practitioner Databank, or NPDB. The NPDB is a confidential federal database, a sort of no-fly list for doctors, designed specifically to prevent dangerous or incompetent physicians from simply moving from state to state or hospital to hospital after they've been disciplined. Because Duntsch had technically resigned and was not formally terminated for cause, Baylor's report to the NPDB was vague and toothless. It merely stated that he had relinquished his privileges and that there were no issues related to his competence under review at the time. This was, at best, a misleading half-truth. Furthermore, they sent a letter to the NPDB that was so benign it was essentially a green light. They did not report him to the Texas Medical Board, the state licensing body with the ultimate power to suspend or revoke a physician's license. Why would a prestigious hospital, having witnessed such carnage firsthand, effectively cover for him? The answer lies in a toxic cocktail of legal and financial motivations. Hospitals are businesses, and they live in mortal fear of lawsuits. A doctor who is fired or has their privileges revoked can sue the hospital for defamation, tortious interference, or for damaging their ability to earn a living. These lawsuits are expensive, time-consuming, and can generate negative publicity, it is often legally safer and financially more expedient for a hospital to quietly cut ties with a problem doctor, allowing them to simply move on and become someone else's problem. Baylor Plano chose the path of least resistance. They passed the buck, and in doing so, they reloaded the chamber of a loaded gun and passed it to the next unsuspecting institution. With his privileges at Baylor Plano gone, but his Texas medical license still pristine and unrestricted, Christopher Duntsch was free to seek employment elsewhere. In July of 2012, just weeks after paralyzing his best friend, he applied for and was granted temporary privileges at Dallas Medical Center, a smaller, less prestigious hospital in the suburb of Farmers Branch. The credentialing process at Dallas Medical Center was a catastrophic failure of due diligence, eager to bring on a neurosurgeon who could perform complex and lucrative spinal fusions. They took Duntsch at his word. They reportedly failed to make the necessary phone calls to the heads of surgery at Baylor Plano. They did not speak directly with Drs. Henderson or Kirby, the surgeons who had witnessed his incompetence firsthand and were already trying to sound the alarm. They relied on the clean NPDB report, the glowing letters of recommendation from Tennessee, and the impressive curriculum vitae. They saw the MD and the PhD and saw an asset, not a time bomb. The reprieve for the patients of Dallas was tragically short-lived. Just 4 days after receiving his temporary privileges, Duntsch scheduled a surgery for a 63-year-old educator named Floella Brown. She needed a routine cervical fusion to relieve pressure on a nerve, a very similar procedure to the one that had left Jerry Summers paralyzed. During the surgery, Duntsch made a catastrophic error, slicing one of her vertebral arteries. This is a known but rare complication. A competent surgeon would immediately recognize the injury and repair it. Duntsch, however, seemed oblivious. He packed the area with a gelatin foam, which did nothing to stop the arterial bleeding into her brainstem. Hours after the surgery, Floella Brown became unresponsive. Scans revealed she had suffered a massive stroke. She was declared brain dead, and her family made the agonizing decision to take her off life support the next day. An otherwise healthy woman had walked into a hospital for a standard procedure and was now dead. Unbelievably, just a few days later, before the full details of Floella Brown's death had been processed by the hospital administration, Duntsch took another patient into the operating room at Dallas Medical Center. Mary Efford, a 71-year-old great-grandmother, was scheduled for a spinal fusion. The details of this surgery, as later revealed in court testimony, are the stuff of medical nightmares. Duntsch operated on the wrong part of her spine entirely. He drilled into her muscle and soft tissue, mistaking it for bone. He misplaced the surgical hardware so badly that it served no structural purpose. He then damaged multiple nerve roots, leaving screws dangling in the soft tissue near her spinal cord. Finally, in an act of almost unbelievable malpractice, he identified a healthy, functioning nerve root, mistook it for a tumor, and amputated it. A pathologist who later examined the tissue sample confirmed it was a healthy nerve. When Mary Efford woke up, she was in excruciating, intractable pain, and could no longer feel or control her legs. She was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The twin disasters of Floella Brown's death and Mary Efford's paralysis, occurring within a single week, finally forced Dallas Medical Center to act. Duntsch's temporary privileges were immediately revoked, but once again, the system of accountability failed. Like Baylor Plano before it, Dallas Medical Center did not immediately report him to the Texas Medical Board. Critical weeks, and then months, slipped by. During this period, Christopher Duntsch still held a valid, unrestricted Texas medical license. In the eyes of the state, he was a surgeon in good standing. And so, he simply moved on again. He found work at outpatient surgical centers, facilities with even less oversight than a full-fledged hospital. He operated at Legacy Surgery Center in Frisco, then at University General Hospital in Dallas, and the pattern repeated itself. More patients were injured. A 55-year-old woman named Kelly Martin went in for a minor procedure to shave down a herniated disc. She should have been home the same day. Instead, during the surgery, Duntsch severed a major artery. She bled to death in the post-anesthesia recovery room. Another patient, Jacqueline Troy, had her vocal cords paralyzed during surgery, leaving her unable to speak above a whisper. Another, Jeff Cheney, had a sponge left inside his spinal column and nerves in his neck, irreversibly damaged. The trail of destruction grew longer and more horrifying with each passing week. By this point, a small group of physicians in Dallas could no longer stand by and watch the carnage unfold. They had seen Duntsch's work up close, had been called in to perform desperate, often futile, salvage operations on his victims, and were horrified that he was still allowed to practice medicine. Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby became the leaders of a desperate campaign to stop him. They began a relentless crusade, writing letters, making frantic phone calls, and compiling detailed evidence-laden reports of Duntsch's botched surgeries. They sent their findings to the Texas Medical Board, pleading with them to take emergency action. Their language was stark and unequivocal. They described him not just as incompetent, but as a sociopath, a clear and present danger to the citizens of Texas. In one letter, Dr. Kirby wrote, "He is a sociopath. He is the worst surgeon I have ever seen." The Texas Medical Board, however, is a large, state-run bureaucracy. It moves slowly, deliberately, and is often constrained by a legal process designed to protect a physician's right to due process. An investigation was opened, but it crawled along at a snail's pace. The board is equipped to handle cases of misconduct or standard malpractice, but the sheer scale and severity of Duntsch's errors were almost without precedent. Investigators struggled to comprehend how a neurosurgeon with an MD and a PhD from a major university could be so fundamentally, catastrophically inept. Was it a substance abuse issue? A psychological breakdown? Or something more sinister and intentional? While the board deliberated and the investigation crept forward, Duntsch was still seeing patients. He secured privileges at one final facility, Methodist Hospital in Dallas, where he was scheduled to operate on his last victim, Jeff Glidewell. In a stroke of luck for Glidewell, just before the surgery, Dr. Kirby discovered Duntsch was still operating and made a furious call to the hospital, warning them of his history. The hospital, alarmed, assigned another surgeon to supervise Duntsch. During the procedure, Duntsch once again made a grievous error, mistaking Glidewell's esophagus for a tumor and cutting a hole in it. The supervising surgeon immediately intervened, stopped the procedure, and took over. Glidewell developed a severe infection and was left with lifelong debilitating injuries, but he survived, a fate he likely owes to Dr. Kirby's last-minute intervention. Finally, on June 26, 2013, after months of relentless pressure from Henderson Kirby and a growing stack of victim complaints, the Texas Medical Board acted. They issued an emergency suspension of Christopher Duntsch's medical license, citing him as an immediate and continuing threat to public welfare. 6 months later, in December 2013, His license was permanently revoked. After 2 years and 33 victims, his surgical career was definitively over. But for the prosecutors in the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, the story wasn't finished. Revoking his license addressed the future threat, but it did nothing to provide justice for the past. The victims and their families had been told repeatedly that their only recourse was a civil malpractice lawsuit, a long, expensive, and uncertain process made even more difficult by the fact that Duntsch was woefully underinsured. But Assistant District Attorneys Michelle Shughart and Jacqueline O'Connor saw something more than just incompetence in Duntsch's actions. They saw a pattern of behavior so reckless, so far beyond the pale of accepted medical practice, that it crossed the line from malpractice into a criminal act. They began to build a case, a novel and audacious legal strategy that had rarely been attempted, let alone won, in the United States. They weren't going to charge him with murder or manslaughter for the deaths of Floella Brown and Kelly Martin, which would require proving he specifically intended to kill them, an incredibly high bar. Instead, they focused on a different charge, injury to an elderly person, a first-degree felony carrying a potential life sentence. The victim they chose to build their case around was Mary Efford, the great-grandmother left in a wheelchair after Duntsch had amputated her nerve root. This charge had a different, and perhaps more attainable, standard of proof. They didn't have to prove he wanted to paralyze her. They only had to prove that he intentionally and knowingly committed acts, the act of surgery, that resulted in her serious bodily injury. They had to prove that his actions demonstrated a conscious disregard for a known and substantial risk. It was a fine legal line, but one they believed Duntsch had unequivocally crossed. The criminal investigation unearthed a crucial and utterly chilling piece of evidence, a window into Duntsch's mindset that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It was a long, rambling, and deeply disturbing email Duntsch had sent to his surgical assistant and girlfriend, Kimberly Morgan, in December 2011, just before his destructive spree in Dallas began. In it, he laid out his grandiose ambitions and his twisted philosophy, but it was one specific paragraph that made prosecutors' blood run cold. He wrote, and I quote, "What I am is I am a man of science. What I am is what I have been trained to be. Anyone close to me thinks that I likely am something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist, because how can I do anything I want and cross every discipline boundary like it's a playground and never ever lose? Unfortunately, the sensual side of my life is not as rich. I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer." That email was the smoking gun. It provided a potential motive, a glimpse into a mind that was not just arrogant but perhaps malevolent. Was he literally confessing his intent to become a killer? Or was this just the hyperbolic, narcissistic bluster of an egomaniac? The defense would argue the latter. They would paint a picture of a brilliant but inexperienced surgeon who was overwhelmed by a new and challenging environment. They claimed the hospitals were at fault for not providing him with adequate support and supervision. They argued that these were tragic mistakes, the result of poor training and a chaotic workplace, not criminal intent. This, they insisted, was a case for civil court, a malpractice issue, not a matter for a criminal trial. It was a dangerous precedent, they argued, to start putting doctors in prison for bad surgical outcomes. The trial began in February of 2017. Over the course of 13 days, the prosecution team, led by Michelle Shughart, laid out its case with methodical and devastating precision. They put Duntsch's victims on the stand, one after another, creating a powerful and heartbreaking narrative of suffering. Jurors listened to testimony from people whose lives had been shattered. They heard from Mary Efford, who was wheeled into the courtroom to describe the constant burning pain she now lived with every single day. They heard from the family of Floella Brown, who described watching their vibrant matriarch die from a stroke after a supposedly routine surgery. They listened via video as Jerry Summers, Duntsch's childhood friend, testified from his hospital bed, his voice weak and labored, describing the horror of being trapped inside his own paralyzed body. The emotional weight of their stories was immense and palpable in the courtroom. But the prosecution's case was not just built on emotion. It was built on a mountain of irrefutable medical evidence. Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby took the stand as expert witnesses, becoming the prosecution's most powerful weapons. Calmly and authoritatively, they walked the jury through the X-rays, the CT scans, and the surgical reports, explaining in clear, simple terms the sheer absurdity and grossness of Duntsch's mistakes. They used analogies a layperson could understand. Describing the misplaced hardware in Mary Efford's back, Dr. Henderson said it was like a carpenter trying to hang a picture and missing the stud, except Duntsch missed the entire wall. They testified that his actions were not just negligent, but reckless, wanton, and criminally dangerous. They made it absolutely clear that what Duntsch did was not within the known universe of surgical complications. It was, in their expert opinion, a complete and willful abandonment of the standard of care. Then, Michelle Shughart presented the email. She projected the words onto a screen for the jury to see and read his own declaration to the court. "I am ready to become a cold-blooded killer." In that moment, the narrative of the trial shifted irrevocably. This was no longer just about an incompetent doctor making mistakes. It was about a man who, in his own words, seemed to be consciously embracing a dark and destructive path. The defense was left with an almost impossible task. They could not dispute the outcomes. Their only hope was to argue that Duntsch lacked the criminal intent, the mens rea, required for a conviction. They portrayed him as a scapegoat, a flawed surgeon thrown to the wolves by hospitals, looking to cover their own failures in credentialing and oversight. They argued his email was just hyperbole, the nonsensical rambling of a man under pressure, not a confession of intent. But against the tide of victim testimony and the damning expert analysis, their arguments crumbled. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. Christopher Duntsch was found guilty of injury to an elderly person for the intentional and knowing harm he inflicted upon Mary Efford. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution presented evidence from the other 32 patients, painting a complete and harrowing picture of his 2-year reign of terror. The jury, having heard the full scope of the devastation he caused, sentenced him to life in prison. It was a landmark verdict, a moment of profound significance in both legal and medical history. For the first time in Texas, and one of the very few times in the nation, a doctor was successfully prosecuted and convicted not for a simple mistake, but for a pattern of surgical outcomes so horrific they were deemed a criminal assault. The line between malpractice and a felony had been drawn. The conviction of Christopher Duntsch sent a shockwave through the American medical community, forcing a difficult and long overdue conversation about accountability, physician oversight, and the systemic flaws that allowed such a catastrophe to occur. The case revealed in brutal detail the dangerous weaknesses in the peer review process, a system intended to be a form of professional self-policing but which can be corrupted by fear of litigation and a cultural code of silence. It exposed the limitations of the National Practitioner Databank, showing how hospitals can use administrative loopholes to avoid filing comprehensive, damning reports on dangerous doctors. It served as a horrifying lesson in the consequences of prioritizing institutional reputation and financial considerations over the absolute, paramount duty to protect patients at all costs. In the aftermath, the Texas legislature passed new laws, sometimes referred to as Duntsch rules, designed to strengthen reporting requirements and close the loopholes that allowed him to move from hospital to hospital. But the fundamental challenges remain. The case of Christopher Duntsch is an extreme outlier, a perfect storm of a deeply disturbed, narcissistic individual and a catastrophically failed system, and yet it forces us to confront an uncomfortable and deeply unsettling truth. We place our faith in institutions, in the credentials on the wall, and in the unspoken promise that the people entrusted with our lives have been thoroughly vetted and deemed safe. We believe that there are checks and balances in place to protect us from the unthinkable. The anatomy of this case is not simply the anatomy of a single, malevolent actor. It is the anatomy of a systemic breakdown, a cascade of failures at every level of oversight. Duntsch was the disease, but the university that graduated him, the hospitals that hired him, and the state medical board that was slow to stop him were the vectors. They created the environment in which he could not only practice, but flourish. The verdict provided a measure of justice for his many victims, but the questions it raises linger, casting a long shadow over the profession of medicine. How many other Dr. Duntsches might be out there, shielded by the same legal technicalities and institutional inertia? The story of Christopher Duntsch is a testament to the courage of the doctors who spoke out, and the prosecutors who dared to pursue a novel path to justice. But it is also a chilling reminder that the most sacred trust we have, the trust between a patient and a doctor, is only as strong as the system designed to uphold it. When that system chooses to protect itself over the patient, the operating room is no longer a place of healing. It becomes a place of profound and terrifying vulnerability. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.